Welcome to This Week in Health IT, where we amplify great thinking to propel healthcare forward. My name is Bill Russell, Healthcare CIO coach and creator of This Week in Health IT, a set of podcast videos and collaboration events dedicated to developing the next generation of health leaders. This episode and every episode since we started the COVID-19 series, and now that we've exited the COVID-19 series, has been sponsored by Sirius Healthcare. Special thanks to Sirius for supporting the show's efforts during the crisis and now beyond the crisis. So Sirius will be a sponsor moving through the end of this year, so we are excited about that. Don't forget, we've gone to 3 shows a week now. Tuesday, we cover the news, Tuesday News Day, and we have interviews with industry influencers on Wednesday and Friday. We are just introducing a new thing called Clip Notes, C-L-I-P, Clip Notes for our interview shows. What is Clip Notes? I'm glad you asked. In conversations with leaders, I've been asked if I can find a way to share with them a list of the best snippets from the show so they can consume it and share it with others, specifically with their staff. This is step 1 of that process. For each show if you sign up for this email list, for each show, we will send you an email that has a summary paragraph of the show, bullet points on the key items covered in the show with timestamps so you can go right to those spots to hear about those topics, and a couple of clips, actual video clips that we have selected. We've hand-selected by the staff to capture what we consider to be the best thinking on that specific show. This is going to make it easier for you to decide which shows are most relevant for which members of your team, and you can even share just the clips via email with your staff. So if you want to sign up for this, please send an email to clipnotes, CLIPNOTES, at thisweekinhealthit.com, and you will be signed up to start receiving these to your inbox. Okay, today we interview Niko Skievaski with Redox. We recorded this episode a few weeks back, and as some of you know, Redox reduced their workforce by as much as 25% since we recorded the show, in what I consider to be a move which shows the leadership that I admire in this company and the team that makes up the leadership. They did an amazing podcast episode on the Redox podcast where they openly discussed the decision of the reduction and solicited on behalf of their team that was let go to help them find work. I think it's a great episode. If you get a chance, the Redox podcast, listen to that episode. They have one of their investors on there, two of the leaders are on there, and they talk through, how they're thinking about it, how they're repositioning or refocusing the company. Great episode and worth listening to. I'm excited to share this discussion with you with Niko Skievaski on today's show. Hope you enjoy. Here we go. This morning, we're joined by Niko Skievaski, the president and co-founder of Redox, a healthcare platform that provides data liquidity to accelerate the development and distribution of digital health solutions. Good morning, Niko. Welcome to the show.
Good morning. Thanks for having me. Happy to be here.
I did that off memory. Is that still what Redox does for the most part?
Yep. You nailed it.
Yeah. At one point, I had invested it in a startup that really was in that same space, and that's when we first met. And I'm a huge fan of what you guys have done. I love the platform and what the team at Redox has been able to accomplish. But some of our listeners may not be aware of what you guys are doing. So give the listeners a short description of what Redox is and does, and then we'll jump into talking about digital health in the U.S.
Yeah, for sure. So what Redox does is, at the highest level, we are helping digital health companies, and that's your early stage startups all the way to large health, large EHR vendors and other groups like that. We help them share data with each other, really. So, for instance, a lot of what we're doing right now during the pandemic is a lot of telehealth and virtual care type solutions are being purchased by health systems, and then they need to be able to share data from their electronic health record with those organizations. And so we pull data out of EHRs, we standardize it in the cloud, and then we make it available over an API to those software vendors so they can use modern kind of web experience to utilize the data. And we do that across the network. So we're in about 700 health systems now across the country. And all the data that we're touching, we standardize in the middle. So if you plug into the Redox network, you can work with any of those organizations without having to do as big of an integration project to get your products up and running.
Yeah, and Redox, it's interesting to me because we talk about platforms a lot on the show. And people may not understand the distinction of a platform, but really it generates value on both sides of the equation, right? You now call it the Redox network. So the value to a health system is that if they plug in, there's so many other users of the system right now that they can benefit by plugging different applications in, because you have application developers on the other side who are developing to your set of APIs. Yeah. And so it has a network effect, right? It grows as each side grows.
Yeah, absolutely. And so when we first started the company, we weren't a network, right? It's like selling the first fax machine, right? You're not you're not plugged into a network. So it was really more like outsourcing at the beginning, where we were like, okay, you could either do integration or you could let us do it, and we're experts and we have the software that we're building to help that happen. As we started growing, the more health systems we add, the more interesting it is for vendors, because they can say, hey, well, if I integrate on my own, I have to go one by one to each health system. Or if I work with Redox, I can just plug into all the health systems that are already on the network. So that's the network effects on the left-hand side of the vendors. On the right-hand side with the health systems, when they look at it, they can now say, oh, there's all these vendors that are already plugged into Redox. So if we work with Redox, then we can get access to working with a number of different types of digital health vendors without having to do a big IT project to get each one implemented. So that really accelerated our growth. After about 2 or 3 years of kind of growing at a linear rate, we started seeing those network effects kick in and really started seeing the growth kind of grow exponentially. So that's what kind of 2018, 2019 was for us, just holding onto the rocket ship as we were onboarding more and more vendors and health systems.
And by the way, for my listeners, this is not a paid episode. If people are wondering, I'm just a huge fan. I love platforms, and I love what you guys have done. But you recently started a podcast, and you cleverly named the podcast the Redox Podcast. How did you guys come up with that name? Did you hire a firm, long hours, lots of coffee?
What was funny is that we were brainstorming for months because we had wanted to start a podcast for a long time. And so it was always like, what do we call it? And so there's a whole podcast channel we have in Slack of just like people throwing out names and us trying to figure out something. And then I went to Matt Maddox, our head of marketing, and I was like, hey, which names do you like? These are our top 3 choices. And he was like, why don't we just call it the Redox Podcast? That's what everyone's going to call it anyways, if it's a podcast by Redox. And I started thinking about the podcasts I listen to, and I listen to a few podcasts from different companies that I follow. And some of them have names, but I always call them, the name of that company. I'm like, oh, it's the Okta podcast, for instance, even though that podcast is called You, I think. So yeah, I was just like, yeah, I guess we could just call it the Redox Podcast. And I think it's worked out. It's quite descriptive. You know what you're getting into.
You do. I'm actually going to use your intro as a framework for questions. I love the podcast. I recently listened to the 2-part series on platforms. I think it's a must listen to. I have Jonathan Bush queued up to listen to. He's a quote machine, so I love listening to him whenever he whenever he talks. He's phenomenal. So your intro, let's just run through it. And you say Redox is on a mission to make healthcare data useful and in turn enable the frictionless adoption of technology in healthcare. And I'm just going to stop there and say, how are we doing? It's June of 2020. How are we doing on that vision?
Yeah, so that kind of goes back to some of the reasons why we started Redox. I worked at Epic before. That's kind of how I cut my teeth in healthcare. And looking around the industry, it's very, every time you go to the doctor's office, you could see 10 different ways that technology should and could be used to make that process more efficient and more effective for the patient experience. And so it seems like there's a lot of that technology could do in the industry. But as you start looking at all the startups out there, basically there's a startup trying to solve every single one of these problems. There's probably 10 startups trying to solve that problem with the amount of funding that we've had in digital health. So what I started thinking about and realizing was that in healthcare, we don't necessarily have an innovation problem. There's a lot of people throwing time and money in companies that trying to solve a lot of these challenges. But we have a technology adoption problem in that, they still use pagers and clipboards in hospitals, not because they don't have a software solution to get rid of those, but because they haven't figured out how to adopt them in a seamless way. And a big barrier to technology adoption is the IT barrier, which is actually setting up the systems, integrating them with the legacy EHRs, a lot of the stuff that Redox does to help enable these technologies to come to market. So that's what we mean by trying to enable frictionless adoption of technology in healthcare. That's actually one of our big, hairy, audacious goal at Redox is to enable the frictionless adoption of technology. So just throw an homage to that.
Yeah, so I'm gonna transition and start talking about some of the challenges we're facing. You go on in the intro to talk about exploring the intersection of healthcare and technology, how technology is making a difference, and the barriers and how they can be overcome. And, there's some of that I want to talk to you about, because having led early stage investments in startups, there's a lot of barriers to overcome from the startup side, and then there's barriers to overcome from the adoption and the healthcare side. But talk a little bit about being a startup and what it takes to go from selling that first fax machine to actually being a platform that's experiencing network effects. I mean, that's that in and of itself is almost a unicorn in healthcare, isn't it?
Yeah. So there are not many platforms that have scaled in healthcare. I think SureScripts is probably the best example of one that's actually reached kind of a critical mass moment. But if you look at platforms like Uber and eBay and Amazon, kind of in the non-healthcare space, in the consumer space, you can reach network effects faster because consumers have word of mouth. They shop based on convenience. Best product wins, best price wins. You can differentiate on those factors. In healthcare, because of the enterprise B2B sale that you typically have to get into, it becomes a lot harder to reach sort of ubiquity and create the platform network effect experiences that a lot of non-healthcare companies create. And that's largely because in healthcare, the people that are benefiting from your product are usually never the ones who are paying for your product. So you have to convince multiple people across the organization to say yes. And there's probably 100 people at a big healthcare organization that have to say yes. And if any one of those people says no, then it can kill your deal. And so that is a huge challenge for startups as they're trying to build something in the healthcare space, is how do you actually make a sale into a health system without sinking 2 years of time and effort in the sales cycle to get it live? And do you have enough funding to actually get through that process to get your product validated and start generating revenue before you run out of money yourself and have to go under? I think that's one of the hardest challenges for health tech companies. With Redox, what we do is we just try to, there's a lot of barriers in place. We try to remove one of them, which is when you get to IT and IT asks, how are you going to integrate? Can you handle HL7? Can you handle FHIR? Can you handle whatever standard they throw at you? You can confidently say yes and give them the plan on exactly how that happens. That's what we work with our customers on. And so we try to reduce that barrier. We help them with security concerns, things like that. But we're not going to help vendors with their value proposition. They still have to make that sale to a health system. They still have to convince their clinical users and administrative stakeholders that their product is worth buying. But hopefully when they get to IT, they're working with Redox, that process can go smoothly from that point on.
Wow. You've given me a lot to jump off of there. I heard someone on the platform say, somebody came alongside them, somebody with some wisdom, and said, if you really want to make it as a health tech startup, make sure you're not selling to the providers, the healthcare providers. And having been on the other side of that equation and said no to about 90%, if not 95% of the startups that walk through my front door, that sales cycle is long. And if you don't have the funds, it can really, I don't know, it can end your company right there before it even gets started. That's the first aspect of it. And the second is, you talk about, the people you're trying to benefit aren't really the ones. If you're trying to do anything for the consumer, they're indirect payers through the insurance carriers and other means. So it's hard to build a platform that benefits consumers in healthcare because they're unwilling to pay for anything because they're already paying for something.
Yeah. And it's it's what we call in health economics derived demand, in that consumers don't have a direct demand for healthcare. Just like, when you go to the store and you buy groceries, you have a direct demand for groceries and you know the benefit that you're going to get from buying groceries and bringing them home and eating them. You don't know the benefit you'll get from buying healthcare as a consumer. We have demand for health. We want to be healthy, but we have to buy healthcare. And so there's a production function there between what we buy and what we actually want. And that derived demand actually creates a ton of challenges with really market failures in the healthcare space, just because it's not a pure market in that consumers don't have a direct demand for the products that they're purchasing. It has to come through an expert like a doctor to tell you, oh, you need a knee replacement versus physical therapy, for instance.
If I rewind to 2012 or whatnot, we were talking about the App Store. Is that essentially what you become, a layer of APIs over this data that exists out there that people can plug into and write their apps?
Yeah, well, so it's funny. You mentioned you worked with another company that was kind of in this integration space. I think the thing that has made Redox successful is avoiding selling to health systems and avoiding trying to become an app store. And the reason is I don't think that healthcare organizations, these big enterprises, they all think that they're very unique, and in a lot of ways they are, right? They have their own demographics that they deal with. They have their own structures and culture. I don't know if they're going to standardize on a way to purchase software that an app store experience creates. So like the iTunes App Store, our kind of first app store example in the market, it makes it so that you as a consumer buys an app the exact same way that everyone else does. It standardizes the process both for selling and buying and finding these applications. If you think about how software is purchased from a health system perspective, there's this huge procurement team. There's legal, there's security, there's IT, and it's this gauntlet that startups have to run through to make a sale. And if for an app store to be successful, you'd have to reform all of those processes and make it so potentially someone as close to the end user as possible, potentially like an actual end user, like a doctor or nurse, could actually purchase software on this app store and implement it in their systems. And I think that we're pretty far away from that. So yeah, with Redox, there is that two-sided network. It kind of feels like an app store, but we don't match supply and demand. So most app stores, you actually go in and you search and you try to find, hey, what's the best calendar app for my computer? And you can find that. So you match up supply and demand. Redox doesn't do that. We get involved after supply and demand is matched. So after a health system says, I want to work with, a Vizia for e-consults, then Redox gets pulled into the mix to help facilitate the exchange of value between supply and demand, but not actually the matching of those sides. And a lot of our competitors over the years have really tried to figure out how to sell something directly to a health system, how to go through that sales cycles, how to reform that buying process. And that's why they didn't grow as fast. So by us avoiding that problem and focusing on the problem of making the developer experience really good, we were able to grow a lot faster and win more market share.
The other thing, and as I'm thinking about this, the other thing we're always concerned about as startups is one of the big players going to turn and all of a sudden point their desire or their interest at the market that we're playing. And, you're playing that intermediary between this really rich data that exists behind the Iron Curtain and the app community. But,
yeah.
The EHR providers are also starting to say, hey, through FHIR, through, I don't like mentioning specific things, but through a series of APIs and a store around it and those kind of things, and through building a development community, we're going to open this thing up. Do you have to keep an eye on that at all times just to make sure that they don't just swerve over and intercept you?
Yeah, for sure. I think it's great what EHR companies are doing and opening up more. That's the right side of history. That's what they should be doing, because the EHR, it's grown too big and it does too much for them to keep up with the ever-changing demands of all of the stakeholders in healthcare. So we need to be able to plug in applications and be able to work with EHRs to enable that technology to actually make improvements in the healthcare space. One of the things so the healthcare EHR market is quite fragmented. And of course, we talk about the really big ones out there like Epic and Cerner and stuff, but still their market share isn't as big as if you think about like the operating system market or even mobile operating systems like Android and iOS, right? They have pretty much a 50-50 split. And so as a developer, you can build to those two platforms and cover 100% of the market. Whereas in healthcare, because of the fragmented nature of the technology systems you're using, it's hard to pick one vendor and use that as your channel. And so therefore you have to end up integrating with many long tail of EHRs. So my hypothesis in the market is that it's much better to have an independent party that can integrate with everybody. So developers can choose to integrate with that platform and then work with all of these app stores that EHRs are coming out with. So Redox has partnerships with a few app stores out there that if you work with Redox, you're basically enabled on that EHR's marketplace. So you don't have to go through their certification, but you can just do Redox. So that's our approach to that and trying to help that ecosystem thrive and really help those EHR marketplaces become more successful than they have been to date. Because like I said, those marketplaces are trying to reform how health systems are purchasing software. And so they haven't been all that successful as being a channel for startups and vendors to work through to actually get more business to health systems.
Yeah. And you can rest assured that Meditech isn't working on a set of APIs to get the Epic data. Epic's not working on a set of APIs to get the Cerner data. And so there's always going to be the need for that third party. All right, so I'm going to transition. We do a very quick podcast here, no more than 30 minutes. So I'm going to close in on the last two questions. You threw out a very big statement towards the end of your intro of the podcast where you say that healthcare will change dramatically in the next decade. Why do you believe that, and where do you think that we're going to see it change the most?
Well, so it was when I recorded that, this was probably December when I actually wrote that and recorded it. So 6 months ago, I want healthcare to...
You were omniscient. You knew what was going to happen in healthcare, I guess.
Well, so because of the inefficiencies that happen in this market, it was more of a hopeful statement that I really hope healthcare changes dramatically over the coming decade. And I gave it a decade because, normally in a market with the inefficiencies that we have in healthcare, if this was a more kind of customer-focused market, it would change a lot faster than that. But I gave it a decade because I'm like, healthcare moves slowly. We're probably not going to see the change that we all want very fast. But the pandemic has dramatically accelerated that change. I think it's exposed the parts of healthcare that people have been saying are broken for a long time. Access to care, rural care, not adopting technologies that everyone knows is obvious, like virtual care tools, telehealth type solutions. So those things are things that were exacerbated by the pandemic, and the need to adopt them became so high that we saw health systems turning on telehealth products that, in a normal time would take them a year or 2 years to implement and roll out pilots and test out in different areas. They turned it on overnight, and then they saw, 100x increase in telehealth visits. And so that's the change I'm talking about. We're going to see a fundamental change in how care is delivered, and that change is going to be driven off of technology enabling it. So it'll be technology-enabled change in our healthcare delivery models. And like everyone's been saying, telehealth we're not putting that genie back in the bottle. It's been implemented. Patients are starting to get used to it. 80% of patients who had their first telehealth visit over the past few months in the pandemic say that they would like to do it again, according to a recent survey that was put out. Doctors are getting over getting out of the status quo and learning how to use it and understanding that they can see patients effectively for certain types of things over telehealth. So we're going to see that settle down over the next 6 months or so, and the telehealth programs will become more established. But then they're going to start adopting tools that really are complementary to telehealth, other virtual care solutions, remote diagnostics, remote patient monitoring, anything that happens outside of the four walls of the health system. And it's pretty clear right now that the healthcare organizations that took risk on patients, the ones that were deep into the transition to value-based care, the ones who were paid on a capitated rate or had a payer as part of their organizations are surviving more effectively during this economic downturn that's caused by the pandemic. So hopefully we'll start seeing more adoption of value-based programs. And with the adoption of value-based programs, that means more incentives to figure out what's going on with patients outside of the four walls of your organization, because you're at risk on that patient's life. And what that means is technology is so suited to do that. And your traditional EHRs aren't really in a place to help you out with that. So I'm expecting a lot more adoption of tools that will help healthcare organizations focus on how do we take care of our populations and make sure that we can track them and intervene so people don't end up a high cost, poor health situation that causes a lot of the costs in the system. So that's the reform that I hope we'll see. And I thought it would take 10 years, but I think it's going to be over the next 2 years now as we pull out of this recession and healthcare organizations figure out how to generate revenue again.
Yeah, I'll tell you what, Niko, it's fascinating to me. One of the things I've been saying to people is we've been talking about digital transformation for a decade, and we just did it in 3 months. I mean, the patients experience digital transformation on how they interact with us. The physicians experience digital transformation. Workers went out into their homes. The culture just in general has dramatically shifted overnight. I'm not sure anyone could have predicted that, if you would have predicted where we're at today, majority of healthcare workers are the administrative workers working from their home, including finance and others. The patients overwhelmingly across the country, at least at this moment in history, being seen via virtual means and liking it, the physicians delivering it, and essentially at a greater than 60% clip saying that they prefer it. And, those kinds of things, if you would have predicted that in 5 years, I think you would have been aggressive. And now we've just seen it in a matter of 3 months. It's amazing.
Yeah, it's phenomenal. And, for a long time, people have been saying that we need to have this digital transformation because a lot of people estimate that about a third of spending in healthcare was waste. And what this means is that coming out of the recession, I think what we might be seeing is a right sizing of the industry, in that it would have been very difficult for a large organization to go digital, because what that would mean is retooling their staff for different skills and potentially laying people off and letting large portions of their staff go. That's happening anyways right now. We're seeing furloughs and job loss in the healthcare space really dramatically. And the jobs that come back online as people start to see volumes increase again will be the necessary jobs. And so the industry might come back and actually be smaller than in the past. And that's good, because we were nearing 20% of GDP being spent on healthcare, which is phenomenally too high. A country of our size should be seeing around 12% of GDP. So what I'm hoping is that when it returns, we'll be in the 16, 17% range. The industry will be a little smaller, but a whole lot faster, a whole lot more nimble, and a whole lot more efficient with how they use technology.
Yeah, if we align the incentives, it's interesting to just think about. You could literally go into a care pathway right now and look at the entire thing and say, does this need to be a physical visit or a virtual visit? And now everyone in the room has a concept for what can actually be done virtually that wasn't done before, all the way through to rehab and home visits and those kind of things. And that has the opportunity to fundamentally change the cost model from end to end. And one of the things I talked about on Tuesday's podcast was just the concept that the payers are going to come back in and redesign what they're going to pay for. And they're going to say, we're only going to pay for this type of visit if it's a virtual visit. And it's going to drive change across the industry just because we've just experienced it. And it's opened up just a whole new conversation.
Yeah, well, and I'm particularly interested in payers and how, so if they're only going to pay for certain types of visits being virtual, why don't those payers provide those visits themselves by employing their own providers? And so we've seen this over the past few years, this sort of vertical integration of payers into the provider space. I think that they should do that virtually and let the hospitals and health systems keep the brick and mortar, but they can take a bigger step into that virtual care space, especially right now when they have so much cash on hand because they're not paying out claims. They can invest in solutions like that and actually provide more care at a virtual level. But then they're competing with their providers that they pay for. So it's an interesting space to watch, and I don't know what the payer strategy is going to be coming out of the pandemic, but I could see a lot of them doing more vertical integration in a virtual standpoint, providing their own telehealth solutions, employing their own docs in that network.
I'm going a little long, but I'd be really remiss if I didn't talk to you about data and interoperability. We have 21st Century Cures Act. We have final rule coming at us pretty quickly. A lot of people talking about, just the overall impact on healthcare. I'm looking at this space, and even before COVID, I was looking at this year and saying, this is the year it really starts to transition. This is the year where the data starts to become more liquid across the environment. And when I talk about data liquidity, I just mean giving access to groups of people that can have the greatest impact with that data. I mean, how are you viewing this time frame within interoperability, and what do you anticipate are going to be the most far-reaching impacts of 21st Century Cures and the final rule?
Yeah. Like you, I was excited and preparing to go to HIMSS to talk to everybody about interoperability, and everyone's plans for meeting the new requirements. And then, of course, HIMSS was canceled, and the pandemic took over our lives in our industry. And it seems like the interoperability rule kind of went to the back burner, but it's still there. It's still really important. Some of the deadlines got delayed 6 months or so, but they're still coming up. I think so there were a lot of things in it, and a lot of them were kind of incremental improvements to the interoperability legislation that we've seen over the past, 10 years now. But what I think was the most important piece of it was the push towards patient access to their own data. And what the law says is that patients should be able to use any app they want And if that app meets the requirements of the API, and those requirements have now been specified to use Fire, then they should be able to get data into that app. And what that means for patients out there is that you'll be able to download an app on your phone and get your clinical data onto it. And who knows what those apps will do. It's kind of what the government's saying is it's almost like if we build it, they will come model, where they're saying if we mandate that the infrastructure exists for apps to get data, then entrepreneurs out there will make applications that can actually engage patients, can help them change their behaviors and get healthier. So we're likely to see this. Right now, consumer health is really focused on like wearables and fitness, but we're likely to see consumer health as a sector grow and start getting a lot more clinical because that data will be made available over a standard format. So that's what I'm hoping. It's a bet because we haven't seen those apps exist yet, but I think over time there will be for lack of a better term, a killer app in healthcare that actually commands the attention of lots of consumers, and that starts the wave of people pulling their data out of their hospitals and health systems onto applications that they control and mediate who gets access to.
So I'm going to push back on you a little, only because the economics of that, and you're an economist in some of your concepts that you talk about, the economics of that really don't make sense. And what makes sense to me is, okay, so I can get to it as a patient, which is kind of cool, but it has to be somebody who's making money somehow either from me. No, it has to be somebody who's making money from me. So Apple can do that because every time I buy an iPhone and it's closed garden, if you will, they're making money. So they're more than happy to aggregate my data, make it available, create new opportunities for me on that. But others they're gonna struggle. They're gonna have to create incremental value on that data, and it could be something that's as simple as taking all this disparate data. Because I know that a certain CEO has said, the patients don't know what to do with this. And I agree with her. I don't know what to do with it. But I could envision a company coming along and saying, hey, you grab all your data and we'll put somebody on the line, on a Zoom call with you who will explain your data to you.
Exactly. Yeah, that's a great idea, a great business idea. And heck, bill for it as a telehealth visit, a wellness checkup, right? So there are business models that we can't perceive yet that people will try. And if you think about all the apps on the App Store, like if you go to your phone App Store, there are so many apps out there that they're all free, right? I've barely ever paid for an app on the App Store, and they figure out a way to exist and a business model that can derive value for their company while giving value to their users. And so we're going to see things like that. And really an application, and if you think about like software development, the application layer is what turns data into information. And information is what's actionable from a user perspective. So yeah, patients don't have a demand for their data. They don't have a demand for an API. They don't know what an API is. But when they use an application that utilizes that underlying infrastructure, that application's job is to surround that data with context so they can understand what it means for their health and what it means for their livelihood. And you can think of ways to actually incentivize patients to do that too, because if you're a company that's aggregating a lot of that data becomes a valuable asset to you, and you might be able to pay patients back for the use of that data, either through great features and technology like Google does, or through actual monetary payments like a data bank model. So there's things that need to be tried out and fleshed out in the market, and that's what 21st Century Cures is about, is creating the landscape to allow innovators to try those things. And so we're going to see a whole bunch of innovation happening and a whole bunch of people fail, but the one or two who make it can actually start a revolution that hopefully will get people more engaged in their health data to the point where we might see a consumerism trend in healthcare, where instead of being driven off of what your employer's coverage is from a payer perspective and what doctor to see through that, to really based off of like what's convenient for you as a patient, what matters most to you, and what's the price point. More like a model where we have direct demand. So going back to that initial concept of drive demand, and we can actually fix a lot of those market failures through great technology and transparency in the market.
Niko, I'm reminded, because I met with a lot of startups that were looking for funding and whatnot. And talking to you, I'm reminded of what it takes to be successful. You are so optimistic, have so much energy, so much passion towards this. But I think it's the optimism. It's, you believe in the industry, you believe in the solution that you've come up with, and you believe in the people that you work with. I appreciate everything that you guys are doing. I appreciate you taking time to come on the show.
Yeah, thanks a lot. This is really fun, Bill.
That's all for this week. Special thanks to our sponsors, VMware, Starbridge Advisors, Galen Healthcare, HealthLyrics, Sirius Healthcare, and ProTalent Advisors for choosing to invest in developing the next generation of health leaders. If you want to support the fastest growing podcast in the health IT space, most of you can say this now without me even finishing it. The best way to do that is to share it with a peer. Stop right now, send an email, tell somebody, hey, this is a great show. I'm getting a lot out of it. You're going to want to check out these interviews and conversations. The second best way you can do it is you can subscribe to our YouTube channel. We're putting an awful lot of new stuff out there, and it's exciting. The live show will only be available on the YouTube channel. It will not be dropped into the podcast channel. Some of you asked me to drop it in last time, but my team here internally wants me to stay focused on the strategy, and that is to have content that is specific to YouTube and to start to diversify our channels, if you will. So some of our content will only be available on YouTube. So get over there and subscribe so you know when it's available. Please check back often, as we're going to continue to drop shows on a daily basis through the end of June, or until we get through this pandemic together. Thanks for listening. That's all for now.